Beyond the mountainous region, at the outlands of the northwest, there was a small isolated village that was only known and visited by few. Seen only by outland hikers, off-road travelers and the likes, a small community that was filled with folklores and mysteries resided a few miles from the lake. The healthy vegetation was nurtured by the sodden soil because of the water source close by, but the deciduous surrounding made it hard for a casual tourist to reach or even see the village. And for the fortunate individuals who were able to find this hidden community, they were greeted by an abundance of supernatural stories. The villagers treasured the tales that were passed down to them by their ancestors, and it was quite apparent inside the vicinity. There were poles with embellished animal skulls on the streets, along with other trinkets made of seeds and bones displayed inside their homes. The community looked nothing like a native tribe at all, but their customs suggested otherwise. Each of their peculiar installations and ornaments were tribal in nature, and they had a significance in their eccentric beliefs. The villagers believed in various things from their past and disconnected them even further from the outside world. Aside from being at the heart of a thick forest, the exotic beliefs in the village had become one of the reasons why visitors come to this isolated community despite the difficulty of finding it. They capitalized on this interest to a certain extent. They openly shared their folklores to the outsiders, and they also sold handcrafted souvenirs that incorporated their myths. They had a number of fabled creatures and deities that were not known to many, and their stories were all connected to nature. These old tales were their means to respect and protect the forest, and some were also meant to instill fear in those who were not cautious enough to the dangers of the wild. One of which was the existence of creatures who inhabited the lake. The villagers believed that these beings were responsible for the missing people who were last seen around that area. According to the myth, they would pull their unsuspecting victims to the depths whenever they had an opportunity. Swimming in the lake had become one of the main activities when the outsiders visited the village. Unfortunately, some of them were never seen again. One of the individuals who disappeared at the lake was a 21-year-old hiker named Jonas Davidson, and I was hired by his family to look for him. They did not believe that Jonas was taken by mysterious creatures, and neither did I. The authorities had already investigated the case before they hired me, but the only thing that they learned was that he was last seen around the lake. I was the family's last hope for finding out what really happened to their son, and so I took on the case despite the challenges that I had to face. It took roughly an entire day of driving across the mountain pass from the closest town until I reached the valley where the village resided, and it took another 5 hours of traveling on foot across the woods before I saw any signs of the community. The forest that surrounded the land between the mountains was breathtaking indeed, but there was an unshakable anxiousness for being too far from civilization. There was no network connection in the area. If one would be in an accident along this long journey, there was nobody close enough to ask for help. My reaction was just the same as any other tourist when they see the bone sculptures and tribal ornaments for the first time. These elements were somewhat mismatched to the appearances of the villagers and their homes, even though they were observably decades late when compared to the other modernized communities. The vintage style of their clothes, along with how they did their mundane chores, were coexisting with beliefs that rooted from centuries ago. Their homes were properly made with wood planks and clay tiles for roofing, and yet there were rows of various animal skulls mounted on the pole fences that were heavily ornate with beads and seats. When I asked what they were for, they told me that the skulls were meant to fend off the bothersome creatures of the forest. Supernatural practices were treated like laws in this community, and each of them was abiding to their beliefs without question. The houses were positioned in a circular row, and at the center of the village was a mount of coals and burnt logs. It was clear that they were performing a bonfire in that area, and I would witness this event during my stay. I also noticed that they were quite fond of the stars. When night came, I saw several villagers staring at the sky. Their eccentric beliefs were simply too many to take in, and I was there to prove them wrong in order to solve the case. I rented a small house where I could stay in while I was there, and it also had the same trinkets as the others. I also noticed some vacant brackets on the windows and a wooden bolt on the door. I assumed that it was the means of security if ever a large wild animal would wander around the village. On the first night of my stay, I heard some weird noises coming from the woods. Initially, they sounded like ordinary hoots from a parliament of owls. But as I kept on hearing them while the night dragged on, it began to sound as if they were uttering words along with their cries. I thought that I must be tired from the long travel, but what I could not figure out was why I would imagine words that I cannot understand. The strange hoots sounded like a foreign language that I never heard of. I chose to ignore it and just covered my head with the pillow so I could finally get some rest. In the same year when Jonas Davison disappeared, 7 other individuals had gone missing in the village. One of them was a young villager, and the other 6 were also travelers. All of the missing people were last seen walking the trail towards the lake, and some articles of clothing were discovered around the shore, which strongly suggested that they had been there and swam. The first villager I met was Old Man George, who found Jonas's bag at the side of the lake. He immediately became the suspect for possessing the belongings of the missing person, but George was a 76-year-old man who couldn't even run if his life depended on it. He probably did the same thing with the other victims' belongings. The villagers did not suspect him because they genuinely believed that the victims were taken by the creatures of the lake, but my task was to identify the real perpetrator. I went undercover and introduced myself as a common hiker to the villagers, and I tagged along with George as much as I could to find out more about what really happened. They said that the creatures of the lake were always watching and waiting for an opportunity to strike. Anyone who would swim alone would be taken by them, especially at night. The warning was pretty simple for everyone to remain safe, but it was expected that most of the outsiders would not listen to it, and they paid the price for not doing so. The lake itself was already a mystery to say the least. Compared to other landlocked lakes, it was unusually deep. These kinds of lakes are supposedly significantly shallower than Great Lakes and could only reach the depth of 25 to 30 feet max. But a group of professional divers who tried to survey the area had claimed that it was around 50 feet deep. Furthermore, they also found a couple of underwater caves which they suspected to be entryways to a bigger cave system. The entry points were so narrow that they were not able to explore it any further. To make matters worse, one of the divers had also disappeared during the survey. According to the villagers, these underwater caves were the homes of the creatures, and the locals were never dared to come near it. The person that I approached next was Liliana, the mother of the local youngling who also went missing at the lake. Without being too direct with my questions, in order to conceal my true intentions, I acted as someone who was simply curious about the myth and how her son disappeared. Liliana said that her child was special, or mentally challenged, and he wandered around on his own while she was busy with her work at the village. The villagers were far more cautious of their actions when compared to outsiders because of their beliefs. If Liliana's child was in his right mind, he wouldn't have strayed far from the community either. I couldn't think of a reason why a local would abduct one of their own. If the assailant was a villager, he would gain nothing from taking Liliana's son. In my deduction, whoever was abducting the missing people was using these folklores to hide his crime. The dangers in the forest were only natural, since the villagers were practically living within the territory of wild animals. But what I found odd was no single body of the victims were ever found. Even the hungriest packs of hyenas would at least leave the bones. My investigation was not leading me anywhere at that point, and the only 2 suspects were an old looter and mythical beings living 50 feet deep underwater. Not that I believed in these creatures, but I had to admit that I felt quite hesitant when I figured out what I had to do next. Since nobody would dare to dive deep into the lake, it would have been a perfect spot to dispose of the bodies. I took my chances and dove in to see if there was anything on the lake floor. I mounted a camera on a tree close by, and I also brought one on the water. If anything would happen to me, I would capture it in a video for sure and hope that I would survive to tell the tale. Luckily, I have fair experience in diving, so going down 50 feet deep should be relatively easy without the need for decompression. I would have roughly 2 minutes to look around before I would need to swim back. But losing breath wasn't really my concern. There was a possibility that a predatory animal might actually be living there and eating people, like an alligator or the likes. And all that I could conventionally bring with me while diving was a camera and a knife. There was a thick layer of algae that I had to break through, which made it even harder to see. I cautiously descended while flashing the path with a flashlight, and my heart was thumping fast since the beginning of the dive. I was afraid to encounter anything that could kill me, and I was already preoccupied in conserving my breath while diving in a lake where a number of people had disappeared. Unfortunately, my efforts were all for naught when I saw nothing on the bottom but a few fish and trash. I dove 4 times to search thoroughly, but I did not find any human remains. The lake floor was murky, and so I tried not to disturb the soil and make my view even hazier. A few feet away from where I was, I saw a portion of the soil being pushed by a stream. It was coming from the deep creases of the rock walls, and I immediately moved away from it when I realized what it was. The stream was coming from one of the entry points that the researchers had mentioned when they surveyed the lake, and it was also the home of the creatures according to the villagers. A few seconds later, I saw some movement when a cloud of floating mud came out from the inside. There was something in there for sure, but it would be foolish to stay a second longer just to see what it was. I decided to call it a day and floated back to the surface. As I was gasping for air, I heard the shrubs rustling at the shore. Apparently, Old Man George was not the only one who was taking advantage of the visitors. When I raised my head to the surface, I saw a kid fiddling with my back. He didn't even bother to wait for me to disappear, or perhaps he thought that I was already gone. He was startled when he saw me, and he almost stumbled out of panic when he hurriedly ran away. I checked the contents of my bag to see if anything was missing. Fortunately, he was just a kid. He was more interested in my harmonica than the gun. My late father gave that to me, and I treated it like a lucky charm that I always brought with me whenever I travel. This time around, it finally served a purpose. The community in the village was fairly small, and it didn't take long before I found where he was, especially when he started blowing the harmonica. All I had to do was listen to the sound. Aside from retrieving my father's memento, there was a possibility that the boy might have witnessed the crime if he also stole from the other visitors. Instead of scolding the boy, I properly introduced myself and taught him how to play the instrument properly. His name was Asher, and meeting him was the first stroke of luck that I had since I arrived at the village. I finally had some new information for my investigation, and it came from a boy who stole from me. Asher began to follow me anywhere I went after I approached him, and he casually told me everything that he knew. He was a 14-year-old bored kid who seemed quite delighted to talk to someone that was not a villager. He was curious about the world outside of the village since he never left the valley, and stealing things from the outsiders became his outlet to satisfy his curiosity. Even though he was guilty of stealing, I decided to ignore his crime since he was just a child who simply wanted to discover something new. He told me the kind of things that he had from the outsiders, and not all of them were stolen. Some of the items were discarded in the forest by irresponsible tourists. I asked him what they looked like in hopes that one of the people he saw was Jonas. According to him, he would just pick an item that he liked and leave immediately, while the other thieves would take all the belongings that they could find and sell them. He also told me some of the names of the villagers who often stole from the victims, and all I had to do was to interrogate them one by one. Asher toured me around the woods, and he enthusiastically explained to me that their peculiar practices as if they were real. He was expressing his beliefs as if it wasn't a matter of mere faith. He sounded like it was practically a part of their lifestyle, a chore that had to be done on a regular basis. He showed me the rituals and charms that the villagers had made in respect to the supernatural creatures of the wild. There were etched markings on the trees, embedded beads on the barks, rows of carefully piled stones, and a few others. The villagers had placed all of these things for their protection and to pay respects to the supernatural beings. They had their own version of gnomes, fairies, and other inhabitants that didn't really pose much threat. However, they consistently had to do all the preventative measures that they had learned from their ancestors in order to remain safe from the danger that was always there. Perhaps all these old tales were starting to get to me, that I started to see things, or at least, that was what I wanted to believe. As we were walking around the woods, I was looking aimlessly at the farther side when I saw movement behind the trees. I didn't look away, since I was curious what it could possibly be, and I was taken aback when it moved again. I rubbed my eyes a couple times, since there was no way that what I saw was real. I thought it was a trunk of a pine tree hidden behind the other, since it was as big as one. But then, it moved from its position. Asher asked me what I saw when he noticed that I was flustered, but I decided not to say anything, since I wanted to believe that it was just my imagination running wild. On the 5th night of my stay, I witnessed the gathering at the center of the village. The residents put up a bonfire and a feast, and it was during this event where their tribal roots were fully displayed. It was quite an attraction for guests like me. The participants were wearing masks made of combined animal skulls, and they were dancing around the fire along with the rhythm of the drums made of animal skins. They were tossing bundles of roots and weeds at the fire, which enveloped the entire village with a distinct scent. Asher told me that it was a ritual for protection, as well as a sign of respect to the olden tradition. With their homes so far away from other communities in modern conflicts, I found it ironic that this humble village felt the need to invest so much time and effort in safety against several supernatural threats. However, I was baffled when the villagers began to chant. They were repeating a verse in a foreign language that was eerily similar to the one that I heard from the hoots of the owls. There was no way that I could have imagined an unknown language before I knew that it actually existed. There were villagers in different costumes compared to the musicians and the chanters. Made of animal hides, bones, branches and leaves, they represented some of the mythical beings from their folklores. Based on their presentation, I finally had a rough idea of what they looked like. These eccentric entities seemed more primordial than alien, and their depictions were quite distinct from one another. This part of the feast showed how the entities were coexisting. It portrayed their roles and function to the forest, as well as the events that could trigger their presence. There were children amongst the performers, and they were dressed with 2 pairs of stitched leaves in shapes of wings akin to small birds. They were representing the fairy-like creatures of the wild, which they referred to as the aeolaers. I was told that they were often heard crying during the night like birds chattering about. The skulls in front of the houses were meant to scare them away, since they could be troublesome at times. If I was to believe their existence, they were the ones that I heard on my first night at the village. It seemed that their cries had different meanings, and it could serve as a warning in case anything would happen. There were also villagers that were covered in algae. They crawled on all fours while letting out a screech. It was the villagers' depiction of the creatures in the lake. The other villagers held up the stalks as they passed along. The vegetation at the valley was particularly richer when compared to the other areas, and the villagers believed that the presence of these creatures were responsible for it. The actors approached the villager and behaved as if they were attacking her, and then another cast of the feast entered the scene as the bystanders began to cheer. His entire body was covered in leaves, and this character was clearly more favored than the others. He was wearing an ornate deer skull with a pair of webbed branches attached to it in replacement to its antlers. The man was standing on stilts to tower over everybody else, and he got rid of the ones who represented the creatures of the lake. They referred to this being as the Guardian. Based on the presentation, they believed that it would protect them when the creatures of the lake would cross the line. For every supernatural problem, they had a supernatural solution, or so I thought. They adamantly believed in the existence of these beings, and so I wondered what made them think that the inhabitants of the lake would attack the village. I asked Asher about it, and I was extremely bothered by his response. He said that the creatures of the lake would walk the surface whenever it rained at nighttime. Those conditions were not hard to occur, and it meant that it could happen anytime. For the first time, I was afraid of something that I didn't believe in. I was trying not to think about it, so I could focus on my investigation, but my senses of reasoning was beginning to waver. The hoots with audible words, the silhouette of a giant in the forest, I wondered if there really was anything to investigate. There were things that I heard and saw which suggested that their beliefs might be true, but I wondered to what extent. The following week, my thoughts were answered during a dark, rainy night. The reason why the villagers were gazing at the stars at night was to make sure that the skies were clear. But on that particular night, the stars were hidden by the dark clouds. I heard the peculiar hoots from the forest once again, but they sounded different this time. Even though I couldn't understand what they were saying, I could tell that they were giving a warning. I walked out of the house when I heard a commotion. The villagers were frantically running about. They were locking their livestock inside the barns and barricading them. I asked the man what was going on, and he dragged me back inside the house. He pulled out a set of planks stored behind the shelves, and he hurriedly slid them in the brackets of the windows to block them. I asked him what the barricades were for, and he said, "It's about to rain, and they will come here. Don't come out until morning." He told me to bolt the door before he left, and so I did. I already had an idea of what was coming, but I didn't want to believe it. When the rain began to pour, there was not a single soul that wasn't behind walls. All the houses were barricaded as if they were used to doing this. A few moments later, I heard some screeches coming from afar. Frightened yet curious, I peeked through the gaps between the planks blocking the windows, and chills crawled down my spine when I finally saw them with my own eyes. It was quite cold that night, but I was drenched in cold sweat. The view was blurred out by the rain, but I could tell what I was looking at was neither a person nor an animal that I knew. They were shaped like humanoids crawling on all fours, and they were creeping across the streets while looking around the homes. I knew that they couldn't see me, but I instinctively covered my mouth and held my breath to avoid making any sound when one of them was passing by. Its skin was hairless and all green, and it had gills on the sides of its thick neck. Its beady eyes were all black and set far apart. It made a shrilling sound when it displayed its sharp set of teeth while turning its head from one side to the other like a predator searching for a prey. The creatures of the lake were real, and they were hunting for food. I grabbed a camera in hopes that I could have evidence of their existence, but it was too dark outside, and a flash of light would surely grab the attention of these terrifying fiends. All of a sudden, a thunderous growl reverberated across the forest as the trees of the leaves rustled wildly. The creatures of the lake were stopped in their tracks, and they all turned their heads towards the sound. Apparently, they were not the only folklore beings that turned out to be real. The green fiends were frightened by something, but I couldn't see what it was, since my line of vision was very limited. I heard some thuds on the ground, and it was getting closer and closer. The creatures of the lake abandoned the hunt and immediately fled. All I saw were a pair of tree trunks that moved and folded human legs. It was probably the same thing that I spotted while we were strolling around the woods. The gigantic being, which the villagers referred to as the Guardian, was drawn in by their presence on the surface, and it chased them away from the village and back to the forest. I stared between the gaps of the planks all night, but they never showed up again. When the morning came, everybody else but me went back to their usual routines. The man who assisted me last night came back to the house and removed the planks from the window. He smiled at me and offered a coffee. I was quite bothered by the fact that they were acting as if nothing happened, and so I snapped at him with a barrage of questions. I asked them why they still chose to stay in the valley despite the danger, and why there was no solid evidence of their existence, even if they knew when they would appear. I asked them about the missing people, and more. He saw my camera at the table, and he decided to show his own. Even though I failed to do so, he realized that I wanted to take a picture of the creatures. He told me that I was not the first person who tried. He showed me some pictures, and a lot of them were taken at night while it was raining. However, there was no single picture where he was able to capture the image of the creature. He told me that he wouldn't show up in pictures no matter how many times he tried. I wondered why the existence of these supernatural beings never reached the media. I came there to investigate the case of a missing person. But when I discovered the truth, I had nothing to show for it. He turned his head to me and said, without any proof, "Who would believe you?"